We decided I'm going to finish it up in this room because then we're going to get started on Radicals for Capitalism. But this is the epilogue, The Blessings of Simultaneity. And I think what the author made out of all this thing of simultaneity, which is life, like, I don't know, I didn't see this grand, like, metaphysical confluence the way he did, but, you know, you needed a structure for the book, I suppose. So, epilogue. The complex structure for peace, so meticulously negotiated by Henry Kissinger and his team of experts, did not hold up. On February 10th, Kissinger started a 3-day visit to Hanoi, the outskirts of which still resembled a lunar landscape from the intense bombings in December. Yet in South Vietnam, the violence continued, and next door, fighting escalated in Laos and Cambodia, prompting the United States to send B-52s on major bombing runs to try to force a ceasefire there. Despite it all, peace abroad remained elusive. Nor did the healing at home that Kissinger had hoped for come to pass. As a result of the power struggle Nixon kicked off with the Democratic Congress, resulting from the December bombings, his impoundment of funds, and his attack on the Great Society. Here's where you can see the author's very progressive bias in this book. You say attack on the Great Society as if that's a bad thing. The Senate voted in the first week of February 1973 to create a special select committee to investigate Watergate and related allegations of espionage in the 1972 campaign. Senator Sam Ervin of North Carolina was chosen to head the committee. He promised to summon various presidential advisors for questioning on the espionage operations when the hearings began. And then the myth of Judge Sirica was born. And I think if this book was accurate, he was a shady guy himself. The ends do not justify the means. Sirica went public days after the jury's verdict to express skepticism that the trial had uncovered the truth. I have not been satisfied, and I'm still not satisfied, that all the pertinent facts that might be available have been produced before an American jury. His instincts were correct, even though his methods were atrocious. I agree. He was a blunt instrument, trampling on the rights of the defendants to due process and a fair trial, to say nothing of impartial and proportionate sentencing. He was more prosecutor than judge, and his actions were as tyrannical as the ones he hoped to expose with his judicial crusading. On that, this author, I think, did a really great job. Before a second Watergate trial in the fall of '74, one in which Mitchell, Haldeman, and Ehrlichman, among others, were found guilty and sent off to jail, Sirica was hailed as Time's Man of the Year for 1973. What has been all but lost in history is the close interconnectedness of the Watergate drama and the conclusion of the Vietnam War. The two danced together in a mutually dependent political ballet. Despite penetrating coverage of the Watergate scandal prior to the election by the New York Times and the Washington Post, and the intrepid reportage of journalists like Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, Richard Nixon scored an unambiguous victory in his re-election in November 1973. Watergate was well known, and the voters did not care. It was the Christmas bombing, however, that was the final straw. Along with the Watergate burglars' trial itself, it was a critical spark to the Senate's Watergate investigation. The constitutional balance of power was seriously out of whack, and it had to be rectified. Congress was unwilling to continue as the stepchild of the executive. The Senate was in a mood to reassert itself. So it's arguable, you all know that I'm a complete dove, but let's just step back. It's arguably correct that the Christmas bombings is what led to the peace accords, yet it was also the Christmas bombings that led to Nixon's waterfall. What did I say, waterfall? What am I trying to say? Downfall. Watergate and downfall, his waterfall. Okay, the date set by Judge Sirica for the sentencing of the trial we had just covered was March 23, 1973. 2 days earlier, on March 21st, John Dean, the White House counsel, had warned Nixon that there was a cancer within, close to the presidency, and it's growing. He tried to get the president to end the hush money payments to Hunt and the others, suggesting that he, Dean, and other White House insiders appear before a secret grand jury to take their lumps so the presidency could survive. Nixon came close to accepting Dean's recommendation, but he eventually recoiled at the thought of people like Bob Haldeman going to jail. He decided to hunker down and tough it out. Hunt and his lawyer, Bill Bittman, received another large payment that evening. On the morning of the sentencing, Sirica dramatically read a letter that McCord had delivered to him a few days later. McCord wrote that there had been political pressure on the defendants to plead guilty and remain silent. Perjury had occurred during the trial. Others had been involved in the operation. The floodgates had opened. John Dean eventually broke with the president and found his own lawyer, Charlie Schaefer, another of Bobby Kennedy's Department of Justice lawyers, who helped put Jimmy Hoffa behind bars. He and Schaefer utterly outmaneuvered the White House and its lawyers over the next few months, with Dean testifying in June before the Urban Committee and damning detail about his conversations with Nixon. Though the nation was mixed about whom to believe, and I can understand that at that time, who do you believe? Things turned out Dean's way when White House aide Alexander Butterfield revealed the existence of the White House taping system and to the Senate panel in July. And that, man, can you imagine just being alive then? Well, I was alive then, but of being like part of this then. You'd be like, what? This was all taped? Holy shit. The fight over the tape saw the firing of Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox in October 73 and a ruling from Warren Burger's Supreme Court in the summer of 74 that Nixon had to turn over the tapes. When the tapes were produced, Dean's testimony was corroborated and vindicated, and Nixon resigned on August 9, 1974. In June 1973, at the same time that Dean was testifying against Nixon, Congress passed resolutions forbidding the president from using any funds to enforce the peace agreement through bombing or any other military activities in Laos and Cambodia. The United States was left powerless to punish the North Vietnamese for blatant violations of the accords. Kissinger wrote bitterly, that and not the legal terms of the agreement ensured the collapse of Indochina. I don't know enough to know how I feel about this, but I kind of, my gut is that was a dirty move by Congress. We made like agreements, and there were like real people over there that were counting on this. I mean, lives, you know, we tend to view things over here when the bombings aren't here and the activity's not here. It's a chessboard, you know, and not into that whole interference there. I don't know. I wonder, I'd love to know how you feel. On April 30th, 1975, Communist North Vietnamese and Viet Cong overwhelmed South Vietnamese forces, which means a lot of people died because we didn't enforce our agreement. And Saigon finally fell. Among the mementos saved in the chaos from the American embassy was an inscribed color portrait of Richard Nixon and his family. In Paris, representatives of the Provisional Revolutionary Government announced that Saigon had been renamed Ho Chi Minh City. As it turned out, it had all come down to the withdrawal of American forces for the return of prisoners, joyful as those events were for the nation and the families involved. Daniel Ellsberg, the man who leaked the Pentagon Papers and was the reason for the existence of the White House plumbers, told John Dean years later that he believed that Dean's testimony saved another 50,000 American lives when it resulted in Nixon's removal from office. And that's the other side of the equation. It's natural to prioritize. You know, the minute you start meddling and there's war, lives are lost. And obviously, as an American, it's so natural to go, well, these were American lives, but aren't lives lives? I mean, I got into that a bit with the Hiroshima bombing thing, where I think it was so easy to do this because it was the Japanese. They weren't like us. And we had so demonized the Japanese at that point. It says, Chuck Colson, with a touch of irony, would plead guilty to a felony count that he attempted to obstruct justice and influence the trial of Daniel Ellsberg, a case that was being handled by a federal judge other than John Sirica. The charges against Colson in the Watergate cover-up case before Sirica and the Ellsberg psychiatrist break-in matter were dropped in return. Colson would be spared the vengeance of Judge Sirica. Now, this is funny, and funny not in a ha-ha way, funny just like in how life works way. I was very familiar with Chuck Colson because of his Christian ministry. was only vaguely aware of his involvement in Watergate, but it's going to get into this a little bit here. Colson emerged from his 7 months of incarceration as a born-again Christian. He founded Prison Fellowship, a successful ministry outreach program for inmates and their families in 1976. He said, "I went to prison voluntarily. I deserved it." You didn't go for everything you did, though. And I'm not looking for a pound of flesh or anything like that, but I'm just saying, as a Christian, I don't know if he's really ever said he got away with a lot, because I never again paid that much attention, but was familiar with his work with Prison Fellowship. It says, "There's no doubt that Nixon and Colson thought they were establishing, to use their term, a new majority," which is the title of a book that had been out that was their Bible. And in that book, the authors were Scannon, that's funny, and Wattenberg, found that demographically speaking, these are his words, most voters were un-young, un-poor, and un-black. The authors posited that in the national elections, demography, I say demography, weird, is destiny. And it said appeal to the real majority, and here's what they described as the real majority. The real majority coalesced around a backlash against a federal government that seemed hell-bent on being the definer, provider, and protector of economic, political, and social rights. Well, in that sense, I don't know whether they had a real majority, but people should have been hell-bent against those things. But sometimes people are hell-bent against those things not because it's a violation of rights, but for an uglier reason, that it was helping the wrong sort of people. Starting with the New Deal and continuing through the Great Society, these rights proliferated and became more and more controversial and the source of voter alienation. Civil rights, including affirmative action, economic rights, not just broad-based programs like Social Security and Medicare, but also welfare and federal food and housing programs for the poor and underprivileged, and social rights, student rights, and most critically, women's rights. The perceived, it wasn't perceived, authors, very progressive bias is coming through. The perceived usurpation by the federal government in these areas was the reason for the counter-revolution. Individual freedom and liberty were felt to be at stake. They were at stake. It says, by the time of the Tea Party, an offshoot or descendant of the religious right and the Nixon counter-revolution, depending on one's perspective, compromise was simply no longer acceptable. I don't believe in compromising rights, so I don't know where that puts me on this, I guess as a radical libertarian. Deadlock in Congress became a form of anti-dissent. I just think they can't do any harm when they're deadlocked. A system built on checks and balances now had only checks. Well, if it keeps the government from doing shit. Now, it's interesting in the end here. And Nixon and Colson foresaw one of the mechanisms that would assist in the counter-revolution. In December 1972, they spoke about need for revenge against CBS, who had been scathing in its reports. Nixon replied, "One thing we're going to do is go all out for cable. I think cable hurts all the networks. That will really stir them up." And it says here, he had no idea. This then is the legacy of the January 73, the me generation. I get really angry at these people going, "How dare you be about you?" Well, how dare you make me about you? The me generation found its voice. Religion became a political force, and poverty and civil rights became someone else's problem. Well, it should always not be the government's problem. It's all of our problems, but just not, the solution is what we disagree on, not the problem. And the national will for concerted action for the common good of all its citizens was scattered into 1,000 points of life. You don't need a national will, we need individual wills. At some point, perhaps, those scattered lights will reform and reunite to give birth. Here's this guy. Play some patriotic music behind my voice. At some point, perhaps, those scattered lights will reform and reunite to give birth to a rededicated nation, one that includes a place for everyone, opportunity for all, and help for those who need it. After all, it only takes a moment in time and some simultaneity. As Lyndon Johnson so aptly observed in his greatest speech, the "We Shall Overcome" speech, there are times in America when history and fate meet in a single space to shape a turning point in men's unending search for freedom. Let us hope such a time is nearing. Let us hope that your fucking progressive vision is not. I would hope such a time is nearing, where it's done through voluntary action and true brotherhood and love for humanity. I really liked this. I want to say liked it as I enjoyed it. I learned a lot. I hope you did too.